Think about this for a second. What if there was a threat you couldn't see, couldn't smell, and couldn't taste? A totally silent biological disruptor that just slips into your lungs with every single breath you take in a polluted environment, actively hijacking the very system keeping you alive. And it does this simply by outcompeting oxygen inside your own bloodstream. Crazy, right? So what exactly is this invisible hazard, and how on earth does it end up all around us? Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to go through a rigorous, step-by-step masterclass on one of the most notorious airborne hazards on the planet, carbon monoxide. Our goal here is to map out its entire scientific life cycle. We're talking the fundamental chemistry, the environmental pathways, and the really profound biological impacts it has on us. Think of this as your definitive guide to exactly how this silent molecule messes with both our atmosphere and our bodies. Here is a quick look at our syllabus for today. First, a gaseous pollutants overview, then we'll look at the carbon monoxide profile, the chemical formation of CO, natural and human sources, and finally, sinks and biological dangers. Let's get right into it.
All right, Section 1, Gaseous Pollutants Overview. Let's establish our foundational context here.
When we're studying atmospheric chemistry, we're usually tracking a group of usual suspects, the 5 major gaseous air pollutants. We've got carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, oxides of sulfur, which you'll usually see written as SOx, and oxides of nitrogen, or NOx. Now, all of these are absolutely critical when we talk about atmospheric degradation and climate change. But today, we're isolating just that very first one. We need to put carbon monoxide under the microscope to really understand its unique mechanics. Moving right along to Section 2, the carbon monoxide profile. Let's look at its specific parameters for survival. First up is its atmospheric lifespan, which is exactly 2.5 months. And from a physical chemistry standpoint, that persistence is actually a huge deal. 2.5 months means a plume of CO emitted from a factory over in one hemisphere has more than enough time to hitch a ride on global wind currents across entire oceans. It literally turns what starts as a localized pollution event into a massive global challenge. The molecule is just stable enough to travel the world before finally breaking down. Next, we've got to define the standard baseline concentration. The background atmospheric content of carbon monoxide is 0.1 parts per million, or ppm. To wrap your head around that, 1 part per million is roughly a single drop of water in a 50-gallon bathtub. It is an incredibly tiny fraction. This is the trace amount naturally hanging out in our atmosphere at any given time. And establishing this 0.1 ppm baseline is absolutely crucial for environmental engineers. Why? Well, because if you take a measurement in the real world and it spikes way above this tiny baseline, it immediately points to an unnatural accumulation. It tells you there's a localized pollution event that needs to be investigated right away. All right, Section 3, chemical formation of CO. Now that we know its lifespan and baseline, let's look at how this gas is actually born. We've got 3 distinct formation processes to analyze here, and each one tells a slightly different story of combustion. Take a look at the top row. This is the incomplete burning of carbon and fossil fuels. This happens when a fire is quite literally starved of oxygen. As you can see in the equation, 2 moles of carbon react with just 1 mole of O2 gas. Because there isn't enough oxygen to fully oxidize that carbon into stable carbon dioxide, the reaction essentially stalls out halfway. It leaves us with 2 moles of carbon monoxide. Now, rows 2 and 3 show what happens in extreme industrial environments, like inside a massive blast furnace. The sheer thermal violence of those temperatures radically changes the chemistry. In the second row, high heat forces already stable CO2 to react with raw carbon materials, stripping an oxygen atom and generating more carbon monoxide. And finally, the third row is direct dissociation. At incredibly high temperatures, a stable CO2 molecule gets hit with so much thermal energy that it literally shears apart into carbon monoxide and a single lone oxygen atom. Which brings us to Section 4, natural and human sources. Let's see where these exact chemical conditions actually happen out in the wild. You know, carbon monoxide isn't entirely an unnatural, human-made thing. The Earth has its own planetary sources for the gas. Think volcanic eruptions or the intense, chaotic heat of forest fires, which provide the perfect environment for incomplete combustion. We also see it bubbling up from natural gas emissions deep in the Earth's crust. But honestly, the most fascinating source is biological. The slow, invisible oxidation of methane gas seeping out from decaying vegetation in swamps and marshlands. Yeah, that eventually forms natural carbon monoxide right in our atmosphere. But contrast those natural occurrences with anthropogenic or human-driven sources. This is where humanity massively accelerates those chemical equations we just looked at. Think about our modern transportation networks. Millions of motor vehicles, airplanes, global railways. These are essentially mobile engines of incomplete fossil fuel combustion. Then you add in the continuous high-temperature reactions happening in industrial manufacturing, large-scale agricultural burning, and solid waste incineration. We are quite literally concentrating the exact thermal and chemical conditions needed to create carbon monoxide on a massive, highly industrialized scale.
This brings us to our final and most critical section, Section 5, Sinks and Biological Dangers. So why exactly is carbon monoxide classified as such a profoundly poisonous gas? Well, it all comes down to a microscopic tug-of-war happening right inside your red blood cells. Carbon monoxide has an affinity for hemoglobin, that is our body's dedicated oxygen carrier protein, that is a staggering 200 times stronger than oxygen. 200 times! So when both gases enter your lungs at the exact same time, it's not even a fair fight. The CO aggressively outcompetes the oxygen. It locks onto that hemoglobin with incredible strength and simply refuses to let go. This means even if you are surrounded by plenty of breathable oxygen in the air, your blood literally cannot transport it to your brain or vital organs. It basically suffocates the organism from the inside out. It's a brilliant, deadly chemical hijacking of the respiratory system.
But thankfully, nature has a way of fighting back. Earth utilizes natural removal mechanisms that we call sinks. First up is atmospheric oxidation. Over that 2.5-month lifespan we talked about earlier, ambient carbon monoxide slowly combines with available oxygen in the air to eventually become stable carbon dioxide. But the second sink, this is a true marvel of biology, bacterial removal. It has been scientifically proven that specific bacteria living in the soil of temperate forests actually consume carbon monoxide directly from the air, and they do it with incredibly high efficiency. So the forest floor literally acts as a massive living air purifier for our planet, scrubbing the atmosphere of this toxic molecule. We've traced the whole scientific life cycle today, from a tiny trace baseline of 0.1 ppm through the high-temperature equations of its birth to its deadly 200 times affinity for hemoglobin, and finally to the soil bacteria that bravely consume it. Which leaves us with a pretty profound final thought. Knowing the stealthy, suffocating biological danger of this gas, how exactly will humanity balance our relentless industrial and transportation expansion against the finite capacity of Earth's living chemical sinks? Our temperate forests and our atmosphere can only process so much. Keep that delicate chemical balance in mind the next time you look up at a factory smokestack or, simply turn the key to start your car. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.